Good morning. You're listening to Retake Our Democracy, a 30-minute weekly show that airs at 8:30 a.m. each Saturday morning on KSFR 101.1 FM, your Santa Fe public radio station. And I'm Paul Gibson, the host of Retake Our Democracy. Today I'm speaking with Jan BOYER, an expert on forest wisdom and a co-founder of onceaforest.org. And we're going to be discussing the fires raging near Las Vegas, New Mexico, and forest management and or forest wisdom together, and whether or not the U.S. Forest Service is guilty for what we are now enduring. We'll get to Jan in just a minute, but I got a few short announcements first. Before we get started, I want to also acknowledge that we are conducting this show on stolen Tewa land, and to thank our Tewa neighbors for being such good stewards of the land. We could certainly learn a good deal from them, and we better learn it soon. Last week, we spoke with Amber Wallen, the executive director of New Mexico Voices for Children, and we discussed the effectiveness of universal basic income on raising families out of poverty and other policy initiatives that support working families. It was a great show, as always, with Amber. I want to remind you that if you're driving around and miss any of today's show, you can watch the full YouTube recording of this show and any prior interview by going to retakeourdemocracy.org, clicking on the Retake on the Radio button on the right side of the home, and you'll find YouTube recordings for all of our previous shows. Now that the legislative session is over, Retake is starting to focus on the primary election. And as part of that work, we have identified races where either solid incumbents are being challenged by moderate or conservative Dems, or where an incumbent is being challenged by a more progressive Dem. We have published our 2022 endorsements for all statewide races and about a dozen legislative races, and even some Bernalillo County and Santa Fe County races. You can find those endorsements by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on Election Central in the homepage banner. Retake is also getting ready for the interim hearings, which have just begun. Retake is working with allies to support their interim hearing strategies, conducting supportive research and initiating dialogue with key legislators on the issues Retake will be focused upon in 2022-2023. Stay tuned, as there will be actions you can take in both the primaries and the interim hearings. In fact, our endorsements page has contact information for you so that you can reach out to any candidate that you want to support and either donate or canvass for that candidate. If you want to keep current on all things New Mexico politics, you should sign up for our blog, now published once or twice a week. The blog offers in-depth coverage of New Mexico politics and policy. It is designed to educate, engage, and motivate you to take action. We also publish action alerts that notify you about actions and events occurring throughout New Mexico. The alerts are especially important during the legislative session, as whenever a bill we support is being heard in a committee, we send out an alert with a summary of the bill's speaking points and contact information for the legislators who will be voting. We also include info on how you can attend in person or participate from home by Zoom and offer comment. You can sign up for Retake's alerts by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on the red Get Action Alerts button on the right side of the homepage. And just below it, you will see a red button saying subscribe to the blog. So you can click both and you won't be disappointed, I promise. One last announcement. Retake holds monthly Zoom huddles on the second Wednesday of every month, but in May we held the huddle a week early, as Roxanne and I will be in California next week to attend our daughter's graduation from med school. Yay. So the next huddle will be on June 8th. You just missed one this month. To find information on our huddles and to sign up to register, you can always go to retakeourdemocracy.org and click on Actions and Events in the home page banner. Huddle information should be at or near the top. And the huddles are a great way to find out more about how to have an effective voice in New Mexico, as we have anywhere from 40 to 100 activists on the Zooms, and we discuss things like forest management, the legislative process, the primary elections, and so forth. Enough announcements. Let's get started. Welcome, Jan. Thanks for making time for this conversation.
Thanks for having me.
I actually do have one more announcement that I forgot. I skipped over it. If you're fortunate, I think today's topic is going to be very raw and a personal one, as I doubt there are many New Mexicans who do not know someone who has been displaced or threatened by the fires. And if you're someone fortunate enough to not be among those impacted, certainly we all are breathing the smoke-filled air and lamenting the loss of so many trees, homes, and critters. After hearing today's shows, I hope all of you will be motivated to contribute food, supplies, and money to help evacuees and those who have lost their homes. Info on how you can do that can be found by going to retakeourdemocracy.org and clicking on the Actions and Events page, where you will find out info on what is needed and how you can contribute. And if you haven't picked up a theme from the introduction of the show, retakeourdemocracy.org is a good resource for a lot of information. Go there and just poke around, and you'll find all kinds of great articles and resources. So let's get started. Welcome, Jan. I always like to let our guests introduce themselves. So how about you start with telling us a bit about yourself and how you got involved in forest policy in general and with onceaforest.org.
Okay, well, I'm pleased to be with you. Thank you. And thank you for all of your work, Paul. I actually have a master's degree in clinical psychology, but that's not why I'm here. Years ago, I became aware, I heard on the radio, that the Forest Service was going to do a prescribed burn. And as I listened, I thought, well, gee whiz, I don't know anything about this. I need to learn more about it. So that was in 2004. So I started reading all the documents I could find, and I started talking to people, and nobody seemed to know what was going on. And I talked to the Forest Service, and they kind of told me that they would be happy to educate me if I wanted. And anyway, I began learning about all the prescribed burns and trying to understand the rationale behind them at that time. But of course, at that time, the burns were very small. Traditionally, the burns were maybe 20 acres at the max to do a small thing that was specific for a particular site. But at that time, I learned that the Forest Service was actually looking at a plan that said they wanted to do an extreme restoration project on 107,000 acres between Desuki and Glorieta. And wow, I thought that's big. I mean, oh my goodness. 43,000 acres turns out to be 67 square miles. And to think that they wanted to do these programs for all of that much land, well, it wasn't clear and specific at that point back then. Okay, it was all very vague back then. I couldn't figure things out very much, but there were a few hints in the documents that said, oh, if an acre has 1,000 trees on it, by the end of things, we want it to only have X number of trees on it, 40 trees on it or something like that. But they wanted to figure it out according to something they have made up that says basal areas of trees, and nobody understands what that is exactly. I mean, I could explain it to you, but it's a long thing. But anyway, it was kind of hard to figure out what was going on. All I knew was, oh my goodness, nobody seems to know, and it sounds like they're going to burn 67 square miles of our beautiful backdrop of Santa Fe. So I began studying, learning, studying, talking to people. And then I ran into this woman, this angel woman named Sarah Williams. And she got all excited about what I was saying, and she thought up the name Once a Forest. And so Sarah and I and Sam Hitt and another friend started meeting and informing and learning and getting together to understand what's going on here, because it seemed to me such a huge deal. And again, the transparency or the lack of transparency was the biggest deal to me. So I studied a lot, and we all learned a lot, and we began doing things like putting letters to the editor and writing my views so that people could begin to understand, hey, this is being talked about and this is what they want to do. And if you have a viewpoint about burning 67 square miles of our forest, especially in this time of climate change, you need to think about it and you need to stand up and do something about it because they're going ahead with it. So over the years, I kept going to their meetings and I kept talking about the issues that I was concerned about. How does this plan help with climate change? Well, they all say that, oh, but if we burn it, we're going to burn it gently and it won't be as bad as if nature burns it. So if nature burns it, you're going to have 10 times the amount of smoke and devastation as if you let us burn it, because nature is going to burn it. It is going to burn. I can't tell. I wish I had a dime for every time a Forest Service person told me, oh, the Santa Fe forest up here between Tesuque and Gloria, it is going to burn.
Well,
So
yes.
that's what they always say. And I'm like, well, gee whiz, if you're that sure it's going to burn, I just don't know how that's going to start, because I've lived here for 35 years and it hasn't burned. But anyway, so this just goes on, and over the years I learned a lot of things about it, and I realized that really I was wasting my time to try and talk to the Forest Service people, because I'll tell you their view right now. Because okay, there's been a meeting now. They have this group called the Greater Santa Fe Forest Watershed Wildfire. I'm sorry, Greater Santa Fe Forest Fireshed, which is a consortium of groups, pueblos, all kinds of groups that want to come together and do a lot of burns to prevent wildfires. Of course, if you go to any of the current research, it's very clear that they do not really prevent wildfires, because land that has burned once is more, not less likely to burn again. Okay, so this meeting was all about these current fires, and one would think, gee whiz, I wonder how sorry these poor people are. They're so earnestly trying to save us from wildfires. Now, these disasters, all these people out of their homes and all this, what's going on? What are they saying? What do they think about all this? Oh my goodness, I hope they figure out how not to set fires on windy days or something. But Julianne Overton, her statement was, gee, the Hermit's Peak fire illustrates that we need to do a lot more burns, a lot more prescribed burns.
Could you
That
tell
is
us who
what,
Juliet Overton is?
oh, she is the spokesperson, one of the spokespersons for the Santa Fe National Forest. And that was her quote. So that's what they take from this disaster that we're all heartbroken about is, oh, we need to do more of this.
Okay, well, I think we're going to arrive at a different conclusion on this radio show. I think
Well,
most of our listeners know something about forestry, but perhaps some of what they know may be based on bad information, as you have discovered. To get at the
oh, but
source
let
of
me
some of this,
say,
I'm sorry.
excuse me, if you want information, go to Santa Fe Forest Coalition.org, and they have a great number of the best research that's current by Chad Hansen and Della Sala and all these people that have done very respected work recently. And they have a great video that tells you all about what does work, like burying the power lines or making your house not so flammable. Those things are very, very useful. But these burns out there do not seem to be so useful. So you can get all the information you want. Onceaforest.org, theforestadvocate.org. There are so many groups all across the country fighting the same thing.
Okay. So what I was trying to get to was that the U.S. Forest Service uses the term forest management, while the Santa Fe Forest Coalition uses the term forest wisdom. I'm guessing there is a world of difference between the two. Can you tease out the difference between management and wisdom in this context?
Well, forest management, according to the Forest Service, is what you've been seeing for the last week with all these fires out of control, 3 of which were prescribed burns that they set on the windiest days. So that's an example of forest management. You have to remember that the Forest Service was started as a liaison with the timber industry. And so their goal is often board feet and how much can they sell. So that's a part of their consideration that we don't really think about all that much. The forest wisdom says that this is one organism, and Simard has come up with all this understanding, and she did the research, and it's very respected, that shows that trees communicate with each other, trees nourish each other, trees feed each other, Trees are amazing. The underground life forms are so strong. Oh my goodness. I can't even begin to tell you how many strong and healthy things are going on under the soil. To say nothing about the fact that the trees are always giving off all of these chemicals that we use as drugs and medicines. It's not enough that they're giving us oxygen and soaking up toxins and carbon dioxide, but they actually provide most of our medicines. Do you really want to burn them all down, especially when some of the species up there may be the last stand of a particular kind that has a, who knows, it may be the next medical answer we need. And if you burn down the last of them up there, guess what? We're out of luck. So there's a lot of that kind of thing going on. But the forest wisdom says, look, as a whole, this is a life-giving source. This forest is the most beautiful thing. It's not just the beauty and the pleasure, but it's the life force of the planet, right? Moderating the toxins, giving us the oxygen, storing the water. So that's forest wisdom, is about how the forest can take care of itself. It does not mind being crowded with itself. And anybody who talks about the conflict of the canopies when trees are too close, there is no basis for that argument. Trees have never complained about being.
Jan, you got to let me ask the questions, because otherwise you're going to answer all the questions before I even get to them. You remind me of my friend Marielle Nanasi. She's the first time I ever interviewed her on the radio, I asked her the first question, and 25 minutes later, I closed the show without asking a second question. So anyway, let's examine a couple of local efforts at forest management and how that has worked out. First, the current fires raging from Las Vegas to Colorado. It was actually started by a so-called controlled burn, right? So can you tell us about how that started?
Well, that's a little bit of a tricky question, Paul, because we really have no oversight. And we don't really know what's going on. All I know is they wanted to do a lot of prescribed burns. We kept calling and saying, well, you're not going to burn on the windiest days, are you? And they kept saying, we'll burn when we think it's right. So they burned, and it got out of control.
So
3 times.
The fires outside of Las Vegas were started by controlled burns.
Yes.
Okay. This is obviously a massive mistake. Has the fire service offered any kind of acknowledgement, or dare I say it, an actual apology about this?
I haven't heard that. Maybe they have, and I haven't heard it.
So,
the one down south by Rio Doso, that's actually a BLM project, but it's the same kind of idea.
Mm-hmm. So what can our listeners do to protest this tragedy? Perhaps more importantly, what can they do to prevent it from happening again? And you get no credit for suggesting not staging a controlled burn on the windiest day of the year.
That's the first thing. Yes. Well, we've been asking them for years to not burn in the spring because of the winds, but also because of the birds, because that's nesting season. And if they're going to burn in the nesting season, guess what? We don't have many birds left, and that's why. We have very few pinyon jays and all of those forest birds, because these burns, when they do the burn, they burn this line around the area, and then they firebomb it. Okay, that means that when they burn the outside perimeter, then the animals can't get out. I know that's only one issue of many here, but it's a big issue for us who love the animals and the birds, because we don't want to see them all die. And they say, oh, no, but they're going to have a better habitat, so the ones in the next township will live and come over here and be great. Well, I just don't want them to kill all those birds to begin with.
I believe that. I just read that the U.S. Forest Service has another forest management plan in store for us, and I think you were starting to allude to that earlier, the Santa Fe Resiliency Project. And this involves the thinning of a vast swathe of the Pecos forest. Can you tell us about this so nicely, benignly named project?
Yes. The Santa Fe Resiliency Project is actually between Tesuque and Glorieta. So it started out many years ago at 107,000 acres. Then they took it down to 53,000 acres. Then they made it 43,000 acres. At this point, it's gone between 38,000 acres and 43,000 acres, but they say they're going to cut a lot of the trees on 23,000 acres, and then they're going to burn 43,000 acres repeatedly. So when I complained about it one time, the forest person said to me, "Get used to it. We're going to burn for 20 years, and then we're going to burn again."
Charming, charming guy. Um, I need to take a break here to remind our listeners that KSFR is more important than ever in these days of misinformation. They offer timely news, accurate news, and alerts in a wide range of programming to keep you sane in these ever so challenging times. So for those of you who can afford it, please consider making a contribution and think of it as your ticket to admission for a wealth of welcome programming. Just go to ksfr.org and click on the donate button. Now let's get back to Jan Boyer. Let's return to the root problem of the Forest Service's approach, management. I just read a study published by the Journal of Forest Ecology and Management from UC Davis that asserts that low density stands that largely eliminate the tree competition are key to creating forests resilient to the multiple stressors of severe wildfire, drought, bark beetles, and climate change. From a lay perspective, it would seem logical that densely wooded forests would have more fuel to feed the flames, so thinning would reduce the fuel and reduce the power of a wildfire. Is this forest wisdom? And if not, what is wrong with this approach?
Well, the problem with that approach is that it's assuming that trees are bad because too many of them is even worse, and they're going to start fires. No, all of that, all of that debris on the forest floor, all of those bushes, all of those leaves hold water. Trees are bags of water made out of cellulose. And I mean, again, why did they burn all those acres of juniper and pinon when juniper and pinon are known to be extremely fire resistant? But they burned acres and hundreds of acres of them. So the deal is, if you open up a forest and you take out all the undergrowth, guess what? The wind is going to come through and dry it out. The sun is going to come and dry it out, and you're going to have more likelihood of burns instead of less.
See, I mean, you look at it from a different perspective, and it makes perfect sense. It's just those guys are supposed to be the experts, right?
Well, it depends on what their purpose is.
Right. But beyond the obvious destruction of a pristine forest and scores of homes, what are some of the other consequences of these massive fires?
Oh my goodness, well, what about the health of the people in Santa Fe? Everybody I know has red eyes and is choking and coughing when the smoke these days. And the Forest Service refuses to do, what do they call it, a health impact assessment that they could give to people so that people could report to them, "I'm suffering these symptoms from the smoke. Please don't smoke. Please don't burn on windy days. Or tell us when you're going to burn so that we can leave town." But, that's just one of the pieces. The money, the people who've lost their homes, my goodness, all of these are impacts. If we lose all of those animals and birds up there, who's going to be eating the bugs, if not the birds? Right? There's so many implications here. The toxicity of what they're using. They use potassium permanganate. It is not a nice thing. It is a neurotoxin. If you look up the MSDS, the Material Safety Data Sheet on potassium permanganate, it's not too good because it's carcinogenic, it causes lung problems, and when it's burned, they say, "Oh, it's burned, there's nothing left, it evaporates into the air, it's gone." No, it produces a manganese dioxide, which is implicated in everything from mad cow disease to ADHD. I mean, it's not a good thing, and they're putting pounds and pounds and pounds of it. They drop these little things with like 3 grams of it in each ping pong ball, but we're talking about thousands of acres. So if they use even 15 ping pong balls full of it on every acre, you've got a lot of toxins. And then that's inflamed and it covers the state in a lot of poisonous stuff that we're all going to breathe. To say nothing about breathing the wood smoke, which causes heart attacks and strokes and cancer and everything else, and all the toxins that are stored. I mean, we live near Los Alamos. Those trees have a lot of plutonium, DDT, all kinds of things like that. And do you really want to burn them so that we breathe them? This is, to me, a big implication for the health of the community.
I agree. I agree. Um, Clearly, what we are experiencing now in New Mexico is the future of the West. Aside from ceasing all fossil fuel use, what would forest wisdom suggest is the best forest-based strategy for preventing wildfires?
Plant trees and save the old trees. The Forest Service refuses to save the big old trees. Now they finally said they wouldn't take any that are bigger than 16 inches, but boy, it took us months to even get that. They shouldn't take any of the big old trees. We have hardly any big old trees left. There aren't that many that are.
I just waving to you that we're almost out of time. I want to give you time. We're almost out of time. We've got about a minute and a half left. Jan, can you tell our listeners where they can get more information about these issues and how they can get what they can do to take action?
Yes, the first thing is to go to onceaforest.org and sign the petition saying, I request the Forest Service do an environmental impact statement before they continue the cutting and burning, because they've already done 3 projects of this thing and they haven't even done an environmental impact statement. We want and call your elected officials and say, please oversee the federal projects and ask the Forest Service to do an environmental impact statement before the cutting and burning.
Okay, well, now we've got that out to the public. We can go back to the questions. And there's you when we talked on the phone before the show, you told me about another misguided forest management activity going on within the city of Santa Fe. It's not really a forest, obviously, but tree management. Can you tell us about the thinning projects the city is conducting?
Well, it's not really a project the city is conducting. It's just something that somehow the person in charge of the river is allowing somebody to cut down all the invasive species in the river. Well, if they cut down all the invasive species on the Santa Fe River, guess what? We're not going to have any shade on the whole river because most all those trees are what they call invasive species. They've cut down hundreds of them already. People aren't even aware of it. When I talk to people, they're like, oh, gee, well, I never go over to that part of town. Well, I go to that part of town and I see hundreds of stumps that are there and nobody knows about it or why. Why is this being done? Because somebody has a view about invasive species. So that means that the exhaust from Alameda goes right into the park. That means that there's no shade for various stretches of the park anymore. Why is that? I'd rather have the trees. I mean, if I'm dying of heat, I'd rather have shade.
Yeah, invasive or not, right? Okay,
Yeah.
well, we're going to continue this conversation on our podcast or our YouTube recording, but we're going to have to close it now. So I want to thank Jan for being with me today. I want to remind our listeners that I'll be back next Saturday morning at 8:30 a.m. Not quite sure who my guest will be, but I'm sure it'll be good. We may be running a repeat show because Roxanne and I are going to be out of the state. So thank you for listening. Stay active, stay healthy, stay engaged. It's the only way we fix this mess. And thank you, KSFR. Okay, we're back. And we are not under a time constraint at this point. So you told me about another thinning project in Santa Fe at the Rose Park, which is a beautiful park, beautiful urban park. Can you tell us what they did there and why?
Well, somebody who said they were in charge for the city came and put a note on the tree and said, oh, community, we're going to cut this tree down because we're afraid it's dangerous and it's dying. Well, this happens to be a tree that many of us have spent a lot of time under. It was a beautiful tree in the Rose Park. And yes, it was old and it had some funky branches, and they said one of them was getting to be dangerous. And we said, can you prop it up? And they said, no, we don't do that. It's too big, and besides, there's a canopy conflict. These trees are too close together. We shouldn't have this big tree here anyway. And me and another friend who were at this meeting said, well, gee whiz, it looks beautiful and every tree on it is just vibrantly green. And they said, no, no, it's got a fungus, it's dying, it's near dead, and we need to take it down. And 20 people showed up to say, no, we like this tree, leave it up. But then they talked and talked and said, no, it's dying, it's dying. We need to take it down. And besides, it's too close for this canopy conflict thing. And trees aren't supposed to be that close. We can't have it that close. That's not good. We shouldn't have that many trees in Rose Park. And the people were like, really? And then they came and cut it down and it's gone, and they replaced it with a little teensy tree about an inch and a half in diameter, and the big old tree that we loved is gone. Why? I don't know.
It's called management, not wisdom. I don't know.
So I
So,
think these things are not, they're not being addressed because nobody in town knows about them. And
well,
that's the problem. People look at me and I say things and they say, "Are you making it up?" Because it's not in the newspaper very much. They leave the details out. That's a huge piece of the problem. The only reason I know the details is because I started watching the records and the documents in 2004. Because then they admitted a few of the numbers. The current evaluation, the assessment that they did for this whole huge project of 67 square miles, they did not give the details. How can they do that?
I don't know. So, once again, can you give our listeners an idea where they can get more information about your organization and your work?
Yes, onceaforest.org, theforestadvocate.org, Santa Fe Forest Coalition.org. They all have lots of information. And, we know that they're going to take down 95% of the trees because every single project they've ever done in the whole forest that I've ever seen is always 90. No, there was one that was more like 80%, but almost all the rest of them were like 94 to 96% of the trees are gone. So it's not as if they're going to take down a few trees.
Yeah. Okay. And before we close, I want to thank my friend Sam Hitt, who you've referenced. He's the person responsible for me having any sensitivity to this issue at all. He was on a radio show about a year or two ago.
We
So
love Sam Hitch. He's wonderful.
he is wonderful. All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today, Jan, and good luck with this. And we're going to write a little bit of a blog about it coming up soon, because one of the things we're working on right now with Retake is setting up local resilient communities. And because we don't feel like we have much leverage over the federal government when it comes to climate policy, the best strategy is to work locally where we can develop systems that are resilient and capable of adapting to whatever's to come. And forest management or forest wisdom has to be a part of that, especially here in Santa Fe. And unfortunately, it seems like the U.S. Forest Service has co-opted the term resiliency because they have a whole policy around forest resiliency, and it's not a wise policy. So thank you very much for being with us. And thank you, listeners. We'll be back hopefully next week, if not in 2 weeks. But thank you very much and goodbye.